when you look at the different physical activities or exercise and how they affect the brain, different types of exercise affect the brain differently. So you certainly need a smorgasbord of all of them to kind of get global support for the brain. But something that seems to be particularly beneficial is coordinative exercise or open skill exercise, plus or minus things that have a navigational component. And these are essentially sports or activities where you're constantly having to respond to the environment and adapt. That's what makes them open skill rather than closed skill or unimodal exercise like going for a jog or sitting on a bike or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So when they compare sports or activities that have the same amount of physical challenge, but at different amounts of cognitive challenge because of the open skill nature, you see greater benefits in terms of brain structure, improvements in cognitive function.
And open skill just means high level of unanticipated variety or variety. What is that?
Both. It basically has a greater amount of complex motor skill required.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it can be learned. So dancing is one example, right? So because you learn the steps of a dance.
Single strongest activity for dementia prevention. Am I overstepping there?
Yeah, probably. If you look at physical activity and the effect that it has on cognitive function and also mental health.
Or one of the stronger.
Yeah. But in terms of both mental health, so studies in depression, as well as studies looking at different activities that people do and their risk of dementia, and studies where they randomize people to different types of activity, including dance. Dance seems to have the highest sort of effect size compared to other types of physical activity. But there's multiple components to dance, right? So you have to learn the steps, but there's also a social component, there's a music component, right? All these things are probably like part of the magic sauce together. But open skill sports also include, board sports or ball sports or team sports where you're having to like react to the environment and other people around you.
Do you say bull sports like rodeo? What are we talking?
Ball sport. BALL.
Oh, okay. I was like, it's not going to be good for the TBI to get people on top of bulls, but yeah, okay, got it.
Although I think bull sports would probably be good if you could avoid the TBI, actually probably right up there. Similarly, martial arts, also good as long as you don't get punched in the head a bunch or kicked in the head a bunch.
Or choked out too much.
Or choked out too much. Beyond the physical strain that these exercises have, they seem to have an additional aspect of, requiring reaction speed, challenging processing speed, learned complex motor skills. They seem to have an outsized effect in terms of cognitive function.
Yep.
Something else, this is kind of an aside, but just based on the physical activity component, when you're looking at so more aerobic or, even like closed skill, unimodal, running, cycling kind of sports, the benefit seems to be intensity dependent. So yes, if you're not doing anything, then going for a walk and walking a certain number of steps a day is going to be great, beneficial, decreased dementia risk, absolutely. But looking at hippocampal structure and function, for instance, which you mentioned, right? You're talking about measuring your hippocampus on an MRI scan. Higher intensity activities seem to be better. Probably the longest study where they ever did something like this was an Australian study where they had people do the Norwegian 4x4 protocol 3 times a week for several months.
Oh my God.
And so for anybody who doesn't know what this involves, it's 4 sets of 4 minutes on a treadmill at 85 to 95% of your maximum heart rate. With 4 minutes rest, you do that 4 times. It is miserable.
I mean, that's like, pretend like you're being chased by wolves through the snow for 4 minutes and then take a 4-minute rest.
And then doing it again.
Yeah. Okay.
4 times.
Right.
But they saw significant improvements in hippocampal structure and function that were maintained for several years after the end of the trial.
Several years?
Several years after the end of the trial.
So a few months.
Yeah.
And then sustained for several years.
Yeah, I think they followed them up for 5 years after the end of the trial.
That makes it much more interesting.
I think a lot of this is driven by lactate.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the various things that support the brain through exercise, we often talk about BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is increased with exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But the BDNF that you produce, that you can measure in the blood, that's produced by the muscles during exercise, doesn't really get into the brain very readily. Most of the BDNF we have in the brain is produced locally, and it's actually driven by things like lactate. So lactate does get into the brain. The more lactate you have in the blood, the more it gets into the brain. And then that acts as a histone deacetylase inhibitor that activates the production of BDNF. Ketones do the same thing. Osteocalcin, which is released when we sort of load the bones structurally, right, is released from bones, seems to do something similar. So generating lactate seems to be beneficial probably because one of the things it's doing is it's generating more BDNF that then is associated with improvements in hippocampal structure and function. So as long as you're doing sports that have some high degree of intensity, so you're regularly producing lactate, and then either in the same sport or separately doing these sort of high skill, high reaction time, open skill kind of sports, that's probably going to be beneficial from a exercise standpoint.
I'm still completely stuck on the 3 times a week, basically VO2 max training, right?
Yeah.
For a few months. Is a few months like 3 or 4 months, or how many months was it?
This study was either 6 or 12 months. I can't remember the intervention period. It was one or the other.
And with durable effects over a follow-up period of
5 years.
5 years or something like that. Like, that is a great investment.
Yeah.
That makes it a much more compelling sales pitch for me. And like, I've done plenty of VO2 max training in the past, but like, it's not necessarily fun, right?
No.
I mean, I will say, if you can, again, avoid getting your arm snapped, Exhibit A right here with my elbow surgery. But if you can avoid the breaking limbs and getting choked out too frequently, something like jujitsu, right, is actually fantastic, because you might have 3 to 5 minute rounds, and then you take a break for a round, and then you go back in. And chances are, depending on who you're rolling with, it's going to be pretty intense.
Yeah.
Obviously, it depends on how competitive the gym is. But the durability is just remarkable. That is really, 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 really interesting. Now, is the threshold for sufficient intensity? I imagine it varies tremendously from person to person, depending on lactate threshold, right?
Yeah.
But like, for you, do you need to do something approaching the Norwegian 4x4 to cross the threshold sufficiently in your mind, or does something less suffice?
The problem with having just one, I mean, it's one very good study, but just having one study on this is that we get really focused on the protocol. But I think that anything that is regularly producing, you're getting above your lactate threshold, you're generating significant, several millimoles of lactate. I don't think people need to measure it. But, if you're getting 6, 7 plus, something like that, right, you're definitely going to be in that range.
Is there something like people use a talk test, for instance, Peter Attia talks about this for zone 2 training, where you can kind of have a conversation in belabored short sentences, but you don't really feel like it, as an indicator that you may be roughly sort of in zone 2. Is there an equivalent for that range of lactate?
Not that I know of.
10% from puking into a bucket.
It's definitely going to be misery related. So if I think about a lot of the training that I did as a student, I was a rower, right?
Oh, brutal.
Yeah.
You love misery.
I don't love misery enough, which is why I wasn't as good a rower as I could have been. But there are lots of protocols where you're doing relatively short sprints with relatively long rest periods that still generate large amounts of lactate. And so in studies where they've done this, you're talking about like 30 seconds flat out on a bike or a rowing machine with several minutes of rest times 6, 8, 10 rounds. By the end, right, you can generate a lot of lactate without having to do something continuously for, several minutes at a time. I think I was just reading that one of the favorite training protocols for one of the like world champion rowers was 45 seconds, flat out, like completely flat out on the rowing machine within 6 minutes of recovery, but doing that, several times. And then at the end, right, you're generating several millimolar of lactate. So I think anything like that that's going to get you in that zone, it just requires, maximum effort for even just like 20 to 40 something seconds. Even with several minutes break in between, you're going to be hitting that.
So I imagine the gold standard, do you have some guy in a lab coat and with a clipboard who pricks your finger or something and does these blood draws to determine the millimolar concentration of lactate? Is there a breathable option, as there is with ketones, right? Where you can measure acetone through something that looks like a breathalyzer as opposed to a finger prick for BHB. Does anything like that exist?
No. They're working on continuous lactate monitors.
Yeah.
Some people do sort of have those. They're near being commercially available, so some people do have access to those already.
Ooh,
but equally,
right.
I would argue that it doesn't matter that much. Just like go and do something really, really hard for a short period of time and do that a few times over and do that relatively regularly. Like that's probably enough majoring in the minors that you need to do to kind of get that benefit.
Sounds like my sled assignment. I do love my sled pushing and pulling. You can definitely wipe yourself out with that stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Without necessarily the impact of me trying to run from wolves on a treadmill or something.